Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was keen to speak in this debate today because it's one of those issues that exercises the minds of the public. I'm sure we've had lots of emails on this very topic. And it's one of those issues as well, when we sit and discuss it, as we have been today, we can't really understand why it's taken so long for us to take action on this issue. But what I like about issues like this is that it's an issue around which there is huge consensus across the House, which is quite a rare and quite a beautiful thing to see. And I'd like to commend the Honourable Member for Taunton Deane for bringing this debate forward today. As we have heard, many cosmetic, personal care and toothpaste products contain microbeads, which are contributing to microplastic pollution, which is made up of the fragmentation of larger pieces of plastic waste. And it's estimated that as much as 86 tonnes of microplastics is released into the environment each year in the UK from facial exfoliants alone. And while some cosmetic companies have voluntarily decided, as we've heard, to phase these out, there is currently not yet a legal requirement to do so. And that is actually quite bewildering when you think about the damage that they do, and also when you consider that adding plastics to products like face washes and body scrubs is wholly unnecessary when harmless alternatives can be used. Last year, the Environmental Audit Committee called for a ban on plastic microbeads, and the UK Government thankfully has agreed to put a ban in place this year, with the Scottish Government setting out its own plan to bring forward legislation to regulate the use of microbeads in cosmetics, and committed to working with the UK Government to implement a ban when this is brought forward. The current political agenda, as we all know, is extremely crowded at the moment, with a whole host of extremely important issues. But it's very important that issues, important as this is, are not crowded out and forgotten or slide down the agenda, because it's one of which we must be extremely mindful. Plastic microbeads contained in cosmetics damage our marine environment, as we've heard at great length today, after they are literally washed down the drain and ingested by marine life. It's been estimated by the Environmental Audit Committee that around 680 tonnes of plastic beads are used in the UK every year. And even though microbeads make up a small percentage of microplastics entering the environment, they still constitute preventable environmental damage that cannot and should not be trivialised. We don't need to clean ourselves by rubbing our skin with millions of small plastic particles, and there is certainly no societal benefit, but there is huge, irreversible environmental cost. And there is a real fear that these are building up in the oceans and potentially, as we have heard, entering the food chain, causing irreversible damage to the environment, with billions of indigestible plastic pieces poisoning sea creatures. Indeed, I will.
That, like in the 1980s and 90s, there was a public and media campaign about cosmetic testing on animals that we all became aware of as young people, young women. Perhaps there is a role for media and highlighting this, because it's something that a lot of people just aren't aware of.
Indeed, I think the Honourable Lady makes an excellent point. I would say, though, and maybe this is not scientific, this is anecdotal, I do think the public are ahead of some of us in this House in terms of their knowledge of this. Certainly my constituents helped to educate me on this matter. But you're right, I think that the campaigns like we've seen in the 80s about animal testing have been very effective. And of course the most important voice is the voice of the consumer, where the pound lies, where the spending power lies. So I think that's a very important point. Indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And would she also agree then, moving on from that point, actually that campaign for animal testing came off the back of a time when we knew that things like ajuki beans, rice, salt, bromelain out of pineapples were all just as good as an exfoliant as any of these microbeads. So there really isn't, even a hard flannel will do a reasonable job. So there isn't much need for this.
Again, I think the Honourable Lady makes an excellent point. And I think the most important element of the point that she makes is that we live in a society where the consumer actually prefers natural ingredients anyway. So there's a real selling point for the manufacturers to take on board. It's not just about getting rid of these plastics, which of course is very important. It's about fulfilling the customer demand for the more natural ingredients that they indeed would prefer. I will indeed.
did want to also mention, praise must be given. Many companies are indeed turning this way. They're taking notice of all this public interest. And some companies like M&S, Sainsbury's and Waitrose have got their own brand cosmetics now not containing microplastics and microbeads. So I think that's a good message, but I'm not sure everybody's heard the message yet.
I think the companies that are leading the way on this must be and should be commended. I think for these companies that is a unique selling point for them, for the more well-informed consumer. But of course, there's still a job to do to make sure that all consumers have this information. And I wish these companies luck in getting their message out there. But of course, because there's no legal requirement to move away from these microbeads, I think that still has to be an important part of this change that we seek. But you know, I wish the companies who have made this change voluntarily all the best. The wider problem of microplastics is vast. The UN group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protectionism list the potential effects of microplastics on marine organisms as physical effects. As we've heard today, it's one of the disadvantages, Mr. Speaker, of being so far down the speaking order. The physical effects such as obstruction, chemical effects due to transportation of toxic chemicals, impaired health, impacts on population and ecosystems, including many with important roles in food chains and the functioning of marine ecosystems. We know that microplastic pollution could be more damaging to the environment than larger pieces of plastic because its size makes it more likely to be eaten by wildlife and then potentially enter the food chain. And it's been said, I believe the Honourable Member for Taunton Deane said it, and I know that certainly scientists, marine scientists have said it, that a plate of 6 oysters can contain up to 50 particles of plastic, and that really should give us pause for thought. More than 280 marine species have been found to have ingested microplastics, and the Environmental Audit Committee has said much more research is needed into plastic pollution because there was a huge uncertainty about the ecological risk. However, as we've heard again today, the government can play and should play a role in the preventable use of microplastics in cosmetics. And last year, the Scottish Government confirmed it would legislate to regulate the use of plastic microbeads in cosmetics following the announcement by the Department of Food and Rural Affairs setting out the UK Government's plans to work with the devolved parliaments to ban microbeads in cosmetics. I will indeed.
The Honourable Lady tell me whether, a little similar to the consultation within the UK, within England, that it only largely applies to cosmetic and personal care manufacturers within England, within the United Kingdom? Because what worries me is how we are monitoring those manufacturers outside of the UK and that whole broader issue, because obviously we import quite a lot of these items.
Yeah, and I think that situation will become further complicated by Brexit when we're not all working in a common area. So I think there's a lot of work to do in terms of where we are now, where we move forward, where we want to be, and how our trading relationships change with other nations, and how we, as you say, how we monitor what comes in to our country. So I think there is a lot of work to do here, even though we know that there are plans in motion, and there are warm words, and there are expectations in this House, members of this House, and amongst consumers and environmentalists. I really think there is much to do. Work has already been undertaken in Scotland to research this issue, raising awareness amongst consumers, as we've heard, and encouraging the use of alternatives. And I think the suggestion the Honourable Lady made about natural alternatives is indeed a very important point. And I would like to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Falkirk, who has done a lot of work, much more work than I have done up to this point, on this issue, but unfortunately cannot be here today to attend the debate. He has been a great advocate for raising awareness on this issue and calling for action in this sphere. 8 million tonnes of plastic will be dumped in the ocean this year and will take hundreds of years to degrade. An area of plastic rubbish 3 times the size of the entire United Kingdom has been floating in the North Pacific for decades, and every year thousands of turtles and other ocean creatures are killed by eating and becoming entangled in plastic debris. And as the Honourable Member for North Cornwall has pointed out, when you go on litter picks on beaches, as I have and as many others will have done, the problem of discarded plastic polluting our beaches and our shorelines and our seas is all too clear. This is an issue which makes sense to deal with, Marine litter costs Scotland £16.8 million every year and impacts on our environment, our wildlife, our industry and our tourism. And that is the understanding that lies behind the Scottish Government's marine litter strategy, which has almost 40 new actions to minimise coastal and marine litter. And key to this has been and must be to encourage alternatives to plastic microbeads in personal care products. We know the UK Government is committed to banning microbeads, and it really is time now to get on with it without further delay. And I think this is one of these issues, like the ban on smoking in public places and the wearing of seatbelts. Its time has come, there's great consensus around it, and once we've done it, we'll ask, why did it take us so long? Thank you, Mr Chair.